Hello, I'm Richard Durrant. Welcome to the Barefoot Guitarist. I'm here with a few mates to chat about one of today's most topical, far-reaching and optimistic subjects, the concept of rewilding, and what might just become one of this year's hottest albums, my album, Rewilding. But more importantly, today I'm joined by four extraordinary people who are connected with either rewilding the concept or rewilding the concept album, or both. So without further hoo-ha, here are my guests from just down the road here in Sussex, the wonderful Penny Green, who is the resident ecologist at the famous Knepp estate, and from his studio in the south of France, the English unrealist artist Jon Everitt, all the way from Bognor, musician, composer and medieval prog rock god, Mr. Brian Gulland. And currently in Hong Kong, the artist, sustainable soil advocate and former lecturer on sustainable investment in the Asian region at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Mr. David St Maur Sheil. Give yourselves a clap and a cheer. Yeah, pick it up. So let's focus on Penny. Pen, you're the resident ecologist at Knepp, where you monitor the Rewilding project. You also manage the volunteers and the research students. You studied countryside management at Brinsbury College, and you went on to work with the National Trust, the Sussex Wildlife Trust, and then the Sussex Biodiversity Centre. So welcome, thank you for joining us from is that your beautiful kitchen there? Over in Petworth.
You're just seeing the tidy part of the kitchen.
So you're a Sussex girl, are you?
I am, yes, I'm very much a Sussex girl, although don't tell anyone, but I was actually born over the border in Kent.
Oh, Gordon Bennett.
I feel very passionate about the wildlife and landscapes of Sussex, and can't ever imagine not being here.
Yes. And you used to sit behind me in the church on the beach, didn't you?
Yes. Sea Scouts days.
Oh, the Sea Scouts in Shoreham.
Yeah, Shoreham Sea Scouts. That's where my, it was kind of like a youth club. We used to go there on a Sunday and then go sailing afterwards on the River Ada.
Oh, you probably know I swim to the pole by the lifeboat station every day, and you know that little orange rescue boat that still pootles around, and I have to kind of shout to it so it doesn't run me over. So do you feel like you're looking after Sussex now, doing your rewilding stuff, or do you feel it's got broader implications, do you think?
Well, the rewilding at Knepp really is the vision of Charlie Burrell and Isabella Tree, as you've probably read in Izzy's book. Yeah. And the main part of that project is really the large herbivores, and they're the driving force behind it. So I don't really have to do any of the hard work in that respect. But really, sort of as you said earlier, my role is the monitoring and research side of things at Knepp, but also getting people excited about the rewilding as well. And so it's such a fantastic job to be able to do this, because normally we are very target focused in conservation, but this gives us this amazing opportunity to be process led. So we're led by the processes that these natural wild herbivores bring to the project. So it's all about rolling with it and see what happens. So it's an unusual job
and a relatively new science.
Absolutely. You know at the moment there seems to be quite a lot of doom and gloom in the conservation world, wildlife and what's going on globally, but I think rewilding, as well as all the lovely nature reserves that other organisations look after across the world, rewilding can really help link up those landscapes, link up nature reserves, working with landowners and so on to help make our landscape a lot more permeable for wildlife, and to get us thinking bigger, you know, how the landscape was before we started chopping it up into smaller bits.
Yes.
So I think this is a very exciting time for conservation. Yeah,
I agree, and I should thank you for inviting me along to Knepp in summer 2018. That invite to do that gig with Sam Lee and the Nightingale, that was a real turning point.
Such a wonderful evening, wasn't it? And what a privilege to be able to hear a Nightingale, let alone actually hear you playing a guitar duet with the Nightingale as well. That's fantastic.
It was a little trio thing. Sam had his Shruti box, and then I got my guitar out. And the thing that I found amazing was how close you can get to the Nightingale, because he's in the safety of the bramble bush, isn't he?
Yeah.
So he knows that we can't get to him, so you get as close as you like, and he communicates with you.
You can hear them from about 1 kilometre away. So the fact that we were sitting right next to it, it had this weird effect on my ears being that close to the nightingale. It kind of gives you goosebumps just thinking about it. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, he's definitely projecting across miles rather than to the back of the auditorium, which is, what I'm used to doing.
Actually, I was going to ask Richard, did you get the rewilding bug when you came to Knepp a couple of years ago when you were playing with the nightingale? Was that your moment of, yes, rewilding is something I want to engage with? Is this something I want to somehow turn into music?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, that visit came just before I set off on my bicycle and did my Orkney to Sussex tour. So I had lots of thinking time on the bike, and it did start to kind of coalesce, and I feel a link with nature. But I've always felt there's a link between politics and nature. It's a responsibility of politics to look after the environment and look after each other, So looking back on my early student days when I used to go marching on CND rallies, it all felt like part of this kind of charge of care, really. Oh, got all political then.
Political's good, especially at the moment. It's good to talk about these things.
When Penny was talking about herds of aurochs grazing across the landscape, I was imagining herds of microorganisms grazing across the landscapes underground as well, I mean, in a way we have to use our imagination to think down there, but there's trillions of herds and herds of these tiny microorganisms, animals down there, So.
Doing the same job.
Doing the same job, but on a smaller scale. And they're really important ecosystem engineers, aren't they? Our earthworms and all the microbial biomass and bacteria even in our soil, they're all important.
Yes, I feel very, very drawn to that fascinating underground network that provides nutrients from place to place depending on where it's needed, and the symbiotic nature of all that unseen stuff moving about.
The Barefoot Guitarist is sponsored by RichardDurrantAcademy.com, helping guitarists to develop their talent since 2017.
Well, let's turn to Mr. Jon Everitt, my lovely friend Jon. Jon, you studied illustration at Reigate School of Art. You became a graphic designer, and then in the noughties, you turned to fine art, and you now exhibit widely, of course. And recently you left Southsea to live in the south of France to continue with your painting and playing your guitars. Well, that all sounds jolly nice.
It's dark and miserable work, but somebody has to be there,
So has the darkness and the lightness got anything to do with your move from Blighty to the south of France?
No, I find my pictures are just as sort of darkly mysterious as they were in Portsmouth. I'm painting a picture for somebody at present, and she's asked for something. It's based on somebody they're caught in a storm of musical instruments, and I painted it a long time ago. It had a very, very dark, stormy, very British sky. And this lady said, well, actually, I quite like a sky from down here in the south of France. So she's getting a much bluer, nicer sky. And she's still being rained on by assorted lutes and guitars and pianos and trombones and things. But
is it fair to mention Hieronymus Bosch?
I think he's probably a very distant relation. I've always been fascinated by him. Even when I was at school, there was a large book of Hieronymus Bosch which I studied carefully till somebody noticed me doing it in the library and was like, "You shouldn't be looking at that, you're only 11.
Oh, crikey.
It blew my socks off. I loved it. And then I went on to Salvador Dali. But no, I wouldn't say I have anything particularly in common with either of those, actually.
Well, the number of things that are in your paintings. Can I describe the front cover? Because for me, it's me in a strange boat on the Sussex Weald at the foot of the Downs. I'm in this huge wooden construction. It's on wheels as well, and it's being pulled by two aurochs or Oroxen.
I think it could be Oroxen.
So I'm in a boat pulled by two extinct giant cows. I'm sitting at the top of the boat looking down upon a huge tree that's growing out the centre of the boat. There's a music stand. The tree is full of instruments. There are crumb horns and bassoons, which Brian's responsible for, and guitars and ukuleles. And it looks like I'm trying to guide this boat along the Sussex Weald. And to me, you have painted what it feels like to live the life of a musician. It's like trying to steer a 250-ton wooden boat using a guitar and a couple of extinct cows with a tree growing up the middle. It's exactly what it feels like, don't you think, Brian? I want to be that bloke in the TDK ad where he's got his chair just in the right position between the big speakers and he's listening to music, his hair's being blown back and he's looking at the album cover, just like we did when we were kids, buying a piece of vinyl.
I think that's one of the great pleasures that the CD generation missed out on. I mean, I remember as a kid, spending my ill-gotten pocket money on, going to Stacks of Wax in Farnham and coming home with a big orange plastic bag, taking the album out. I remember particularly Thick as a Brick, Jethro Tull.
Oh man, you can read that for hours.
Fantastic. And album covers were so special. And of course, when I went to art college, everybody wanted to be Roger Dean. So, they're desperately trying to teach us, of course, life is not all like this. You'll be designing things for people who make dog food and stuff. And we're going, no, I want to design album covers. This whole thing it's bizarre. It is a bit like a dream. I mean, I spent school holidays sitting in my room with Salvador Dali, listening to John Williams on my dad's Sony tape recorder with a pair of borrowed headphones on. So, it was always an ambition to be somehow linked with all this. And suddenly here I am, I'm down in the south of France. I've just done my first proper album cover. I'm across the border from where Salvador Dali lived, even though I'm not a big fan these days. It's all sort of coming home to roost, which is immensely exciting.
Well, that's also why I went to the Royal College of Music. I wanted to make albums. I wanted to make tubular bells. It was that kind of thing. It was like the ultimate art form was to be on vinyl inside a beautifully designed thing. Like Thick as a Brick is a classic. I think it takes longer to read it than it does to listen to it.
It does, yes.
Oh no, actually, I've just remembered the drum solo on side 2. You can read the whole thing during the drum solo on side 2.
Yeah, sadly, the shrinking down to CD size makes the whole exercise lamentable, and there's little to see within that tiny square. Come back 12-inch by 12-inch, please.
Absolutely.
Well, it is coming back. It's back.
My first albums came just as CDs were in the ascendant. And vinyl was gone. Everyone was selling their vinyl, putting it into skips.
Oh, how young you are!
No, I was just a late starter, Brian.
Yeah.
That's what it was. I had your album on cassette, mate. I stole my brother's cassette copy of Midnight Mushrooms. I gave it back to him this summer.
I'm afraid my mate Alex recorded Midnight Mushrooms. I held my hand up, guilty, sorry. You'd be a millionaire without me.
No bother.
Well, that's all fascinating stuff, and we're now going to focus on our next special guest, Brian Gulland. Brian, you sang as a boy at Canterbury Cathedral School and studied, like myself, at the Royal College of Music. You were also involved in the early music revival centred around London in the early 70s. And then, with fellow RCM student Richard Harvey and the wonderful guitarist Graham Taylor, you formed the medieval prog rock band Griffon, with whom you toured the US with Yes, and you were playing bassoons, crumb horns, recorders, and singing. And after Griffon, of course, Griffon is still continuing, but you also had a spell with the French folk rock band Malicorne. So what a pedigree, and it's fantastic to have you on board today. Thanks for joining the party.
Yes, thank you. I feel very privileged because since we met, I've now a major musical brother and a close friend. Playing for you on Rewilding was a real joy and indeed an inspiration to me.
The feeling is entirely mutual. It's just fantastic to be working with you. I have to say that I'm not surprised you've been writing again, because music does appear to to flow from your fingers, toes, lips, lungs and beard. Has it always been so?
There have been long periods of time when nothing arrived, a result of just not being in a receptive state. But music is always hanging in the air, asking to be plucked, fertilised, watered and nurtured. We're going to be working and writing together for the first time shortly. Musical ideas are pouring out of me, and I'm catching them in my shrimping net.
Yeah, there's stuff flooding out. I mean, Griffon is still recording, and I feel really privileged that you played me some of the tracks. And I mean, to me, it sounds better than ever. It really does. I mean, do you feel it's better than ever?
Well, I can't say that, but how it seems to me is that every time we come out with an album, and that's just 2 in the last 3 years, there was a gap of 41 years before that one.
So time to ferment nicely.
Quite so. But it surprises me every time, the diversity of musical ideas and styles that keep bubbling up from each of us.
Yeah, it is astonishing. I mean, some of that stuff sounded to me like a bit like Colosseum 2. It was very complex and dense and a lot to listen into. In that way, it was a better experience for me because there was just so much to get your ears round.
Well, it was a challenge coordinating mind, lungs, fingers and lips around some of it. I think I know which track you're talking about here.
Well, yeah. I mean, it was great working with you on Rewilding. You really did put so much extra magic into that album. I mean, I was really looking forward to your contribution on bassoon and recorders, but then your keyboards, there's something very beautiful, spiritual, churchy. There's a quality about your keyboard playing that really bedded into the album. And then you pulled out the crumb horns and the oboe. Now the oboe is a bit unexpected. On one of the tracks, your oboe lead is like a, I don't know, shaft of light from heaven, I would say, Brian.
Glorioski.
Yeah, absolutely. And you got green fingers. We got to link all this in with the Rewilding stuff. The first time you came round to my studio, you got to hear this, guys. Brian brought with him not just his crumb horns, but he brought a little envelope full of bat guana. And it said on the front I had to webble some into my compost, using the webble verb for the first time. And it turned around my herb garden, Brian. And I've seen photos of your herb garden.
Well, you very kindly gave me a sunflower, a young junior model in training. It's been a great success, and there will be a reciprocal gift in return, which will row itself along the coast to your harbour very shortly.
I look forward to that. Well, your advice, Brian, if you remember, you said to webble some into my watering can and then use that on the herbs, and they just went literally through the roof. Most musicians that come into the studio, they want to look at all the stuff and talk about music. Brian asked if he could look under the lid of my compost bin, and then we webbled in some bat guano. That was an enlightening encounter.
I'm intrigued about the bat guano being compost. That's a lot of bat guano you need for that.
Well, fertiliser rather than compost. It's been removed from caves, particularly in South America. It was very heavily regulated how much was allowed to be extracted per year, going back to the 18th century, I believe. It's particularly high and balanced in the 3 main nutrients, potassium and whatever the other 2 are.
Potassium, nitrogen and phosphorus, and then all the other minerals and things.
Yes, thank you. Just going back to the keyboard business, you've reminded me of something my comrade in another band I'm in, the New Scorpion band. He plays all the twangy instruments, ancient guitars, lute, banjo, mandolin, bouzouki, and what have you.
The twangy stuff.
I was just multitudinating away on the harmonium in a busk-worthy way in a rehearsal break, and he remarked, "The thing about you, Brian, is the cathedral's never very far away, is it?" I suppose I was weddling. Yes, it has had a very profound lifelong influence, those years at the cathedral.
The Barefoot Guitarist is sponsored by RichardDurrantAcademy.com, your companion to guitar mastery.
So, we haven't yet spoken in detail to David. David all the way from Hong Kong. Well, let's do a David summary, shall we? David, you've been involved in sustainability and organic growing projects throughout the Asian Pacific region. You were a joint founder of the Association for Sustainable and Responsible Investment in Hong Kong, and you were also a lecturer at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Oh yeah, you also drew the inner sleeve for my Rewilding album, which is fantastic, and you've included all the track details, but you've got these amazing networks of roots and fungal networks and all the rest of it.
Yes, I absolutely love it. Brilliant work.
You appear as a protozoa, don't you, Brian?
I do indeed, and I'm very proud of it.
Me too. I'm also a protozoa. So when I read Rewilding by Isabella Tree, I was really surprised at how much I loved the chapter on soil, and it left me really wishing that there could be a Jacques Cousteau of the soil. Someone that could go down there, like Raquel Welch's micro sub or something, and look at it and describe it. But you have described a lot of that anyway, so obviously you're captivated by it.
Well, thank you, Richard, and it was an absolute thrill for me to be asked to do that inner sleeve, the hidden bit, and I also feel that it takes like a little leap of imagination to imagine ourselves down under the soil and those trillions of microorganisms and life that's in that sort of skin that surrounds the earth, where the soil is healthy, and rich. I think, when I drew all of you as little protozoas, I was just trying to express that like energy of life that's going on down there.
And the lovely thing, when you drew My Daisy, she plays accordion on the album. You found a protozoa that's got like a bellows-like part of its body.
There's an extraordinary diversity, and I looked through so many different sorts of protozoas looking for ones that I thought somehow related. And I did find one that had a lovely accordion feel to it. So that was the one I used for Daisy.
Yeah, she looks absolutely beautiful.
I wasn't sure if you'd appreciate yourself being a flagellate. Flagellates use these sort of long appendages to sort of pull themselves around through the soil,
It's yet more typecasting, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I had the flagellate extensions, it might be easy to steer John's boat that he's put me on. Interesting you talk about the kind of energy of it all, because that's something I really have tried to reflect in the music. Nature can't just rewild, it can't just sit there like a clod of soil and rewild itself. It needs movement. So underneath, there's the stuff that you're talking about. We're putting this podcast together using Zoom, and Penny's right at the top and you're right at the bottom. So Penny's the superterranean and David, you're the subterranean.
But there's also a great link between the two, because the dung from the herbivores will be pulled down by beetles and earthworms and so on into the soil, helping the soil health recover by bringing all those nutrients in. And then the worms and the moles and all those subterranean creatures making lovely sort of spaces, aeration areas that can then help absorb more water, help alleviate flooding. And so there's so many amazing subtle things going on between the two worlds.
I think they're so totally interlinked, and that's why I tend to think that it's important to think of rewilding the soil, just as one psychologically is thinking about above the surface, the plants, the trees, all the animals wandering around, and they're absolutely interconnected, and we need to rewild the soil as well, because even though many of you may have heard 1 teaspoonful of soil has ever so many millions of microorganisms in it. I've heard from between 20 million to even up to 1 billion. The thing is, so much farmland is almost sterile. Even if it does have microorganisms within it, they're pathogenic in many cases, and you need to get the oxygen back into the soil. You need those roots to get down and the fungal networks to get going and all that incredible microorganism life to get going. And in many cases, it isn't there. So just as we need to rewild the surface, we need to rewild under the surface. The two mutually support each other. The more vigor there is under the surface, that vigor and all the minerals and nutrients and stuff will get up into the plants and ultimately comes through to us and will reinvigorate us as well. It will make us healthier. So everything is interconnected, and I think that's what's so important to know.
And it traps carbon. Can you explain that?
In terms of this hugel culture that I've been making recently, I built a hugel culture for my mum, which is a sort of big mound culture, and you bury the tree trunks into the ground and then all the branches and leaves and everything. So you're locking the carbon into the ground. So it's a sort of combination of compost heap and garden bed. It will provide nutrient for years to come. The thing is, what we're realizing now, it's particularly the fungal networks which hold the carbon in the soil. Many people think it's the bacterias, but it's primarily the fungal networks. If all the world's farmland was transitioned through something like regenerative agriculture or rewilding today, we would basically lock enough carbon within the soil within 30 years, not only to turn around climate change, but even to bring us back to like 100 years ago, you know. So there's extraordinary potential in the ability of the soil to hold carbon, with most very misunderstood at the moment, but our understanding of the soil is going forward in leaps and bounds over the last decade, and people are getting excited by it.
And there's been quite a lot of stuff going on at Knepp connected with soil as well, isn't there, Penny? Astonishment at the speed of regeneration.
Yeah, so we've been really lucky to have a link recently with Cranfield University, and it's not really until a few years ago we realised that the soil data was the bit we were missing. That's probably the most important bit of information, because everything builds from the soil up. And in recent studies a couple of years ago, they found that we doubled the amount of carbon in the soil since the Rewilding project started 20 years ago. We've got double the amount of microbial biomass built up in the soil as well, and we've seen an increase in fungal biomarkers. So all of this data that we're finding out can really help us learn more about how we might be able to spin this out into the wider landscape, working with other landowners and so on, to help our soil recover, having been depleted from farming and so on in the past. And that's a way that we can sort of look forward and hopefully mean that we can carry on farming into the future for all of our well-being.
Yeah.
Been in the company of the Barefoot Guitarist and friends. I'm Richard Durrant, the Barefoot Guitarist, and you can join me again next time for another nylon-strung cornucopia of things. In the meantime, why don't you brush up on your playing at
richarddurrantacademy.com.
That's my online guitar school. Bye-bye now.